We would like to welcome Dr. Frank Hargrave to the Society this evening for his talk on Hallaton treasure, typical rituals. Frank is currently Museums Manager at Colchester and Ipswich Museums, but some of you watching this evening from Leicestershire will remember him from his time working on the Hallaton Treasure Project and as keeper of Harbour Museum. Frank was instrumental in bringing the treasure gallery to fruition and creating an innovative space to display this wonderful collection, of which I'm very proud to care for as the current curator of archaeology. Frank studied archaeology at the University of Nottingham, which is where I first met him. That was a long time ago. And since then, he's worked at many diverse museums across the country. It was the Hallaton treasure that spurred Frank on to study Iron Age archaeology, which culminated in him completing a PhD on Iron Age ritual sites at the University of Leicester, all whilst working full-time and starting a family, which is pretty amazing to me. That study that was part of his PhD forms the basis of tonight's talk. As Matthew said, any questions, pop them in the chat and I will read them out at the end. Right, so I'll hand over to you, Frank.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, and it's worth saying, actually, I finished my PhD a couple of years ago now, so it's been quite interesting for me to come back to a lot of the things I was kind of looking at in such detail then. But things, of course, have moved on. So, yeah, I'll be really interested at the end of this talk for the people particularly, because there's been many on here, I'm sure, who you know an awful lot of what's happening in Leicestershire and some of the incredible finds that have been coming out. The shield, for instance, I was reading about not long ago, which is fabulous. So so yeah, I'll be really interested in your thoughts at the end of this. Okay, so well, thank you and good evening, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to speak tonight. As Helen says, my interest in ritual and religion in the Iron Age really stemmed from working on the Hallaton site, well, the exhibition rather, for Harbour Museum. Many of you know the circumstances, I'm sure, and the finds themselves, probably in quite a bit of detail. So apologies for any repetition, but for those of you who don't know the treasure, I will give a quick overview shortly. The story around how it was actually discovered has recently been covered in a conference, which can still be watched online, and I'll leave the details of that at the end of this presentation. So I won't speak about that too much, other than to say really that Haliton remains the ideal really in British archaeology for kind of community, university and council collaboration with the initial finder Ken Wallace and the Haliton Fieldwork Group, really to be commended, and they have been commended many times for their actions throughout the whole process. Right, so bear with me, I'll just need to share my screen. I just tried this earlier and it was it took me a moment, so bear with me. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that.
You're good.
So essentially, Haliton appears to have been a shrine demarcated by a palisade and possible enclosure, and inside that shrine there seems to be treasure that was deposited there, included more than 5,000 silver and gold coins, a Roman cavalry parade helmet, silver ingots, and a fascinating little silver bowl amongst the highlights, and many other objects too. Thousands of pig bones were also found just outside the entrance, presumed to have been the detritus from great feasts held perhaps annually during autumn and winter months in the 30s, possibly 40s AD. Almost all of this activity seems to have occurred during the days immediately before and after the Roman conquest. Tonight, in a nutshell, we'll explore it a little more in detail shortly, but the reason for the title of this talk, speaking specifically about rituals, is how this extraordinary site can and perhaps should be looked at in an apparent absence or near absence of similar sites in the country. So for all of you who've watched Time Team or met an archaeologist, or indeed are an archaeologist, you'll probably be familiar with the thrust of these memes. It's something we all smile at, but most of us are still nevertheless guilty of finding ourselves attributing ritual interpretations to features or finds that we can't explain. And often that's because we haven't seen them before. It's particularly odd when you consider that for something to be a ritual, it has to follow a prescribed pattern, and it would therefore have been repeated many, many times. You'd think you would have seen it before if it was a ritual. One of the reasons for this is that it allows us to explain away apparently bizarre activity. As the anthropologist Roy Rappaport said, rituals sanction outlandish behaviour. So when we look at a site like Hallaton, there's this temptation to look at behaviour that's difficult to explain and label it as ritual, as if that's kind of explanation enough. The flip side to this is where we can identify rituals, so where there are those kind of prescribed patterns, trying to look for literal interpretations may be quite actually misleading due to the abstracting effect of ritualization. So repetition can in a way rob something of its meaning, or at least at a kind of conscious level. So this can apply, I think, not only to the way in which ritual deposition occurred, but also in the representation of, for example, art and architecture. Oh, I don't know what's going on there. There we go. So take this cheek piece, for example, from the helmet that was discovered at Hallaton. One of Helen will probably jump in. I've lost count of how many there are. I think we're up to 7. One of the cheek pieces from the helmet. And I remember when this was being cleaned up at the British Museum, I remember a lot of conversation about the symbolism that you can see there of a Roman cavalryman with this kind of winged victory over his shoulder here, trampling a poor barbarian there, crouched over there, look. And considering that the context of the site implies the helmet was buried by local people, it's a really provocative picture. So was this then an act of sedition, kind of war booty, buried as thanks to the gods, made all the more powerful by this imagery, this kind of savage Celts undefeated? Or is it something a little bit more complicated than that? So this is the tombstone of an auxiliary cavalryman, Longinus at Colchester Castle. Longinus died in around AD 49 and was himself of Scythian stock, yet here his grave is, showing him in life trampling the barbarian, the design of which was selected by his equally barbarian colleagues, all serving in the Roman army. This image is a very popular one. I could have chosen any number of examples, but chose this one simply as it's a shameless plug for one of the museums I work at. The repeated use of any image can, not always, but they can have the effect of making it invisible or meaningless to the user. It's a kind of traditional ritual that's followed quite unquestioningly. It means we have to be careful in assuming meanings, particularly where iconography may have become ritualized. Like the meme of the archaeologists interpreting people celebrating Shrove Tuesday, you can read too much into things where they've been ritualized. It's the same with many of our contemporary holidays. The extent to which rituals or traditions, whatever you want to call them, have been adopted, subverted, enhanced, are contradictory, like pagan trees at Christmas or Christmas in December. And how much any of that is understood or unpicked by the celebrants often doesn't really matter to them. What does matter to the celebrant is how accurately the ritual or tradition is performed. That, I think, can be extended to ritualized architecture too, partly due to function, like the extent to which Christian churches typically follow a very uniform pattern. And I think that's particularly important when you look at a site like Hallaton and want to determine where it comes from in the context of Iron Age ritual practice. So this is a plan of the site, and you can see there it's that palisade in red, and that's 50 meters long or so. So yeah, relatively substantial in many ways. The coin hoards are all these little dots you can see here. I think there was 14 in total from memory, and you know, amongst them all, kind of I think up to over 5,000. And this odd little kind of gate here, kind of a turnstile, which we think had something to do with the way people kind of moved through it. Some of the silver deposits were found here with the bowl there, and the helmet, and the silver items seem to have been possibly a foundation deposit. And then the helmets, as I say, later on. The pig bones are all of this in the blue here, so immediately outside, and that kind of had its own symbolism. The whole site, you can see from the north arrow there, face east down a hillside, and again that follows much of the pattern of ritual deposition. So how does this compare to other sites? Are there ritualized elements in terms of deposition, in terms of that kind of architecture, such as it is, or is it something different going on here? So let's break down its component parts. So ritual deposition Coin hoards are relatively common from the introduction of coinage in Britain from around the 1st century BC onwards. But as the vast majority appear to have been one-off deposits in contexts apparently devoid of structure, there persists this usual challenge around whether they represent flight hoards or ritual deposits. Contexts are very rarely properly explored, so the lack of associated features, may be possibly misleading. This is the Wickham Market hoard from Suffolk, and apologies, it's another shameless plug. It's usually on display at Ipswich Museum when we're open. And it's and this was actually associated with a small enclosure. I mean, nothing to get wildly excited about. It is quite a modest enclosure, but nevertheless, there is some kind of structure around, which makes you think, and contemporary to the hoard, which makes you think, oh, it's probably not a flight hoard on that basis. And all 840 status are gold, which has also helped that kind of interpretation that there's deliberate selection happening there, and therefore ritualization. So most hoards are less dramatic, numbering from half a dozen to a few hundred. And although it's possible to identify trends of the deliberate selection of precious metals, there don't seem to be enough to justify ritual interpretation on that account. So around about 60–65% of hoards in the east of England, and by the east of England I include the East Midlands, were of one metal type. And the context too can be a little subjective. Associations with water, for example, is surprisingly easy to make regardless of location, although there's absolutely no doubt, of course, that in the Iron Age in Britain, people were very much drawn to water as spiritual places. And to give you an example, approaching 2,000 Iron Age and Roman coins have been dredged from the River Thet, which is near Caistor in Norfolk, as well as swords, spears and other material. And that's probably the case in many rivers throughout Britain. And these deposits are clearly deliberate, and clearly there's no intention of retrieving any of those objects. And in fact, actually, there's a strong contender for a different type of shrine at Fiskerton in Lincolnshire, where multiple wooden jetties and causeways provide the platforms for votive deposition, which started actually as early as the late Bronze Age, right the way through into the Middle Ages, all these deposits into the River Witham. Witham, incidentally, is also the site of this beautiful shield. It's faded now, but from antiquity. But there's actually a pig, a kind of elongated pig here that can be seen through various kind of techniques. It's worth a look. It's fascinating. But it's a beautiful object. And there's 2 points worth mentioning on the Witham shield, actually. It's finds like this, and weapons and shields and different things into the water of this high status seem to date a little bit earlier than Haliton, probably in the Middle Iron Age. They're quite difficult to date for obvious reasons, lacking that context. But regardless, there does appear to be a tradition, particularly in Britain, where weapons were deposited in water rather than on the continent, where, although you had that as well, of course, famously Latin and Hallstatt, but on the continent, the weapons were also buried at land shrines as well, which seems to be far rarer in this country. These kinds of causeway depositional points are also known elsewhere. But as I say, whether you call them shrines is difficult to say. It all depends on how you think of shrines, really, and spiritual places. However, in the case of Fiskerton and the banks of the Witham, associations with burials from the Bronze Age and a remarkable link actually to medieval monasteries and continuing ritual deposition of weapons, as I say, went on right into the Middle Ages. Which is quite interesting, particularly when you think about Haliton as well, where there's association with later medieval practice. So, returning to the context of Haliton then, and that deposition of coinage and other precious metals, shrines were by no means the only places that great wealth could be buried. The Haliton site on a hillside and facing east conforms with the location of around 60% of landscape coin hoards of the period. Evidently, where it stands out is the sheer quantity of material. For Leicestershire, it boasts, I think, about 50% of all of the Iron Age coins found in the county, a figure that is quite different, really, from many other parts of the country, where similarly vast deposits are probably less distorted by the greater use within communities as money. In Leicestershire, it's generally thought that coins from this period weren't really used as currency. Something we're probably a bit more familiar with now, actually, with coins not really in circulation. Nevertheless, it's still a lot of ritual deposition. There are very few sites in the country that match its scale. One of the most famous sites is Schnetichem, and here numerous hoards of silver and gold torques were found. Oh, there we go. I thought I had a picture of it. And again, all of these wonderful finds were found on the east-facing hillside, and well, hill by Norfolk standards at least. And 75 of the torques were complete, and a further 100 or so are represented by fragments. Like Haliton, the evidence for structures is really quite limited. There was a large enclosure covering some 20 acres, so really quite substantial, but one that wasn't created until at least the 1st century AD. The hoards were believed to have been buried over many years, from as early as the 2nd century BC. However, unlike Haliton, there's no evidence of feasting. So, and it's feasting that really helps you kind of definitively interpret the site as a shrine. And in fact, actually, it's the incomplete torques, the fragments, and the ingots that's led many to interpret the site as something other than entirely ritual, something involving metalwork or potentially flight hoards and things like that. Yeah, I think that can be questioned, and we'll look into that a little bit more. But it's worth looking at the ingots and fragments, the ingots and the fragments particularly, because neither are uncommon finds in ritual context. You get ingots buried in kind of assemblages, in all sorts of landscape hoards that seem to be ritual, and indeed at Haliton, of course, we've got 2 quite significantly sized ingots as well. This is one of them. I couldn't get a good picture. I should have got a good one from you, Helen, earlier. So apologies for that. Because the other ingot in particular, I think, has you can actually see melted coins on the surface. Fragments too, including where silver has been apparently scraped from the surface of a cheek piece, all look a little like people were actually after the metal rather than necessarily focused on the gifts for the gods. You know, perhaps this is why there's a level of selection of metals in some of the hoards I've mentioned as well. You know, it's very hard to say. What is probably clear, though, is that neither Schnetichem or Haliton is likely to have been solely either religious or secular. At Schnetichem, but many other sites too, where fragments or objects that seem a little below par, perhaps, there's this tendency to assume that they're probably not gifts for the gods, that people will naturally select only the very best for the divine. But in fact, anthropological evidence would suggest that people typically give what they can afford, and actually they regularly cheat. And this may explain why there's actually a higher percentage of debased coinage from ritual contexts than those found from suspected settlement scatter or similar. The same can actually be said for the selection of material in the first place. Whilst deliberate selection can and did occur, and still does, the types of gifts to the gods in many cultures can be dictated by things like relative wealth, changing availability, cultural value, and this example is actually joss paper, spirit money, that in some Chinese cultures is still used is today used to substitute for real money during funerals. Other items like paper cars are also acceptable substitutes for an individual to take them into the afterlife. The tradition, the burning of items associated with wealth, is centuries old, predating cars, of course, and probably predating paper money. But the type of object has changed with the culture. We see this in the Iron Age with the introduction of coinage as an acceptable new votive, but still part of the same ritual thousands of years old. Indeed, an even closer analogy may be miniature weapons, found in all sorts of different contexts from the very end of the Iron Age and well into the Roman. These miniatures were probably substitutes for real weapons, and in the Roman period, that's particularly important because it's likely that the indigenous communities wouldn't have had access to real ones. Interestingly, these miniatures also occasionally replicate far earlier weapons from the Bronze Age. So it wasn't just limited to the Iron Age, and you can really look at that, and that's why they would replicate much far earlier. And indeed, actually, polished Neolithic axes and Bronze Age weapons do from time to time appear in Iron Age ritual contexts as as kind of curated objects. There's a couple from Hayling Island, for instance, which we'll come on to shortly. But returning to Schnetichem, I don't know why I can't say that word tonight. If it is a shrine, it is extraordinary for one other reason. It is the only land site of significant votive deposition of metalwork in the whole of Britain, to my knowledge at least, that dates to the 2nd century BC or earlier. All the other sites date to the 1st centuries BC and AD. So much so, I'd even query the dating of the site, which I think, and I may have this wrong, it relies on stylistic analysis of the talks. It's possible they were actually heirlooms by the time of their deposition. Sites that have been more readily interpreted as shrines and that boast significant metalwork deposition include Harlow in Essex, Hayling Island in Hampshire, and Womburgh in Surrey. In all three cases, this interpretation is due not only to the votive deposition, but to the presence of buildings and their later replacement by Romano-British temples. It is also these three shrines that provide the bedrock for some assumptions that I think underpin the study of Iron Age religion in Britain. The predominant one being that there were shrines and temples at all. So this is probably a good point to talk about the architecture and structure of those shrines. So firstly then, this is Hayling Island, and probably the most famous of all. And this really, I think, is kind of the missing link. You can see the Iron Age structure there in the kind of darker grey. And then the Roman form a bit later. And, you know, that continuity is really, really clear cut. That Iron Age building was timber and probably built in the late 1st century BC. So really quite early by many standards. And although ritual deposition may have started a little bit earlier, and that, yeah, so there may well have been in a period when there was an open air element to the shrine. And that's not unusual, by the way, for many shrines. Even those where they start building up temples later on, the vast majority, if not all of them, seem to have had an open air start in life at least. At Hayling Island, there weren't huge numbers of coins, about 500, of which 330 were Roman, but they're all quite interesting. Some of the Roman ones were apparently deposited before the invasion, whilst 30% of the Iron Age coins were Gaulish, and that's far higher than you might anticipate. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there are many more plated and debased coins than you'd expect from other assemblages. Spearheads and other weapons were found in the shrine's wider enclosure, and as I mentioned earlier, that's kind of at odds with most of the kind of land sites in Britain, where those deposits were generally made in rivers and lakes. The architecture, the coinage, and the weapons do all resemble the types of shrines you find far more commonly in northern France, where shrines really become established, very well established by the 1st century BC. They start appearing, I think, from memory, either the 4th or 3rd century BC. Okay, and that's another picture, and that's actually how Hayling Island really kind of develops as a much more structured site well into this kind of 2nd century AD in the Roman period. Oh, that's not a great picture, sorry about that. This is Womburgh now, and sadly, where we started this talk with one of the very best examples of responsible metal detecting and community partnerships at Haliton, Womburgh is probably the very worst. Philip de Jersey estimates between 5,000 and 7,000 Iron Age silver and gold coins were looted from this site, and of course with that, great swathes of context ripped from the ground. Fortunately, they didn't quite take everything, and Womburgh is the site of this rather wonderful religious headdress. This is Roman, and it bears the solar symbol at the top there, and that's a symbol that appears in a lot of Iron Age coins and a lot of iconography from the very late Iron Age right through the Roman period as well. This is presumed to have been worn, and there's about a dozen kind of headdresses that have been found, largely in the south and the east of Britain, and quite a lot of variation within those headdresses as well. And it's really at odds with kind of Roman equivalents. It does seem to be quite an indigenous thing that's kind of crept into this strange mix of Romano-British religion. And they're certainly worn by some kind of priestly class. This is the Kavanam Crown from Suffolk, and this is one actually we commissioned the replica at the bottom right there at Ipswich Museum. And you can't see from the photo, but stylistically, it's manufactured at the back. There's these kind of bands, and that they're really quite similar to this, the deal crown as it's known. And this is really quite interesting, because that manufacture of like those kind of banding was found in a grave from the late 3rd century BC with a very high status individual buried with weapons, but there's no indication of this kind of crown or diadem, whatever you want to call it, of any other kind of structure around it. That's missing here. So it does look like that's how it would have looked, obviously polished up and really quite beautiful. So it's not a military item, or it doesn't seem to be. It's not a helmet. And as I say, the banding and style feels very much like the Kavanam example. The question has therefore always been asked whether there's a link between these later Romano-British headdresses and this later Roman priestly class and the pre-Roman priestly class. And I always hesitate before saying the word Druid, but there it is. But evidently the Romano-British religion undoubtedly was a mishmash of indigenous practices and beliefs fused with the later Roman ones. There were 2 Roman incarnations of temples at Womburgh, but an Iron Age precursor is only evident really from a ditch, and therefore largely assumed only from the quantity of coins that were discovered. The structure of the circular Roman temple that was created in the late 1st century AD is again pretty similar actually to the Hayling Island example. Of the coins that were uncovered, and I think there's about 1,000 of those that were still found within their context, it would again seem that the bulk of them were deposited in the decades immediately before and after the Roman invasion. There's again no evidence that there was a temple structure there that was contemporary to the bulk of this deposition. And the last 3 temples I mentioned, Harlow, and again, Harlow's comfortably interpreted as a late Iron Age shrine, largely due to the later introduction of the Romano-British temple. Indeed, by the 3rd century and 4th century, you can see there, it really morphed into a temple complex, not actually just there, but across quite a large area of what is now modern Harlow. And actually just the north of the temple itself actually was initially built in the Roman period, just north of the structure you can see to the roundhouse on the left, which seems to have been obviously the Iron Age temple, for want of a better word. I mean, this looks like a roundhouse and pretty much is a roundhouse, but it's on this low hill and surrounded by multiple coin hoards. And again, actually some feasting here, largely of lamb. So that interpretation of a shrine seems pretty secure. The emphasis on lamb rather than sheep is interesting, incidentally, because that's the age of the animal, which was similar to the pigs slaughtered for Haliton, implying very strongly, again, that autumn and winter date for feasts, potentially well linked into festivals of the period. In total, around 800 Iron Age and a few Roman coins were found on this hilltop site, with by far the most intense activity, again, in that mid-1st century AD period. There may well have been many more, but the remodelling of the site as the complex grew may have disrupted them. What's interesting at Harlow is that there are the contemporary or near contemporary coin hoards within just a few hundred meters. So that kind of idea of having a sacred area where it would be the only places where you'd have these kind of deposits, again, doesn't seem to be quite so sacrosanct as you might expect. And this is seen elsewhere. So in Colchester, we have a site called Gosbecks, which we rather optimistically today call an archaeological park. It's actually a very large empty field, very popular with dog walkers. It's attracted an awful lot of speculation, however, over many years, but drawn largely because of the activity that occurred in the Roman period. It's located a couple of miles out from the town, but it's on the confluence of 2 major dike systems, which still survive actually to 3 or 4 meters high and for several miles. It's quite impressive. And in the Roman period, quite swiftly after the conquest, and where Colchester actually became the short-lived capital of the new province, this impressive temple complex was built alongside one of the largest theatres in Roman Britain, and the bathhouse actually has only just relatively recently been confirmed as being in the area as well. This is quite a useful artistic reconstruction actually, because I think the scale is slightly wrong. The people look a little, I don't think we're quite that small compared to the temple. That temple, fairly typical in size. They're actually quite small, really, and that kind of gives a sense of how these sites were used. So people generally kind of congregate outside for festivals and for ceremonies and different things, rather than kind of thinking like a modern church or a mosque, for example, where you kind of go in as a congregation for worship. It didn't really work like that. And the temples were, we think, more for the priests, you know, as their kind of that kind of function. And just behind, actually, you can probably just make out this enclosure here. Well, it doesn't really show the scale, but this is quite a vast enclosure, and because of its size, it's actually often gets labelled as Cynoblin's farmstead. And Cynoblen being Shakespeare's Cymbeline and the king of one of the most powerful tribes. There's all sorts of problems in Celtic Britain describing tribes and kingdoms and all sorts of things, but for want of a better word, for the Trinovantes tribe, the Catavlauni tribe of the area, and the Trinovantes of the area. And Cynoblen was died shortly before the conquest. That's the best evidence we have, and his coins are by far the most widespread of any ruler in pre-conquest Britain. However, this kind of interpretation of this being his farmstead is based on very little evidence at all. It is just the connotations of the importance of the Romans, the Roman settlements here, and the dike systems, and as I said, the size of that enclosure. The theatre and temple combo is the only one known in Britain. Well, that's not quite true, actually. There's one that's kind of, I think, in mid-stage kind of excavation now in Oxfordshire. So they might have a sister site, but really this is the main securely kind of identified site of this temple and theatre and bath kind of systems, just outside of a town. There's quite a lot on the continent. And it may well be that the Romans kind of came over, had this kind of model of putting this temple and theatre combo, because of course theatres at that point also often had a religious function as well as an entertainment function. So that's all quite interesting. Of course, it's been assumed that this temple complex would have had an Iron Age precursor, but there really is a lack of votive metalwork associated with it, and that's odd because just a couple of miles away, of course, there was a major mint in the form of in Colchester, in the part known as Sheepen, where there were coin flans found, and many of the coins themselves survive. Similarly, just again a couple of miles to the west is Marks Tay, where 2 or 3 hoards of more than 300 coins have been discovered, apparently quite randomly, you know, no real significant context. One final clue, just while we're talking about Gosbecks, is this rather beautiful Roman statue of Mercury that was unearthed somewhere at Gosbecks, sadly out of context. And classical sources do link Mercury to the Celtic pantheon, and in the archaeological record there does appear to be some affinity between Iron Age ritual sites and this Roman god, but who knows? Whatever you think, I mean, it does seem hard to believe that Gosbecks wasn't important on some ceremonial level in the Iron Age, but as I say, there's really little evidence. And there does seem to be this strange disparity. On the one hand, you have nondescript hillsides where hundreds of coins were poured into the earth with little or no associated features. And then on the other side, you have these sites where there's some structure and even apparent vast legacy like at Gosbecks, but there's almost no finds at all. All that can be said is that votive deposition may not necessarily have indicated a site's importance in the eyes of the Iron Age Britons. This is particularly the case if you consider that almost all of the land sites I've mentioned that do feature significant deposition saw almost all of that activity in just a few decades around the Roman conquest. While we're talking awkward sites, this is my nemesis. This is Fiseham Way, just outside of Thetford. So look at this. What is going on here? There's no parallel that I know of. Described frequently as a royal ceremonial site. This weird roundhouse in the middle you can just see there. It's believed by excavators that it was a 2-story building. And again, I think there's examples in Ireland, but no other really in Britain, again, that I know of. And although the soil here isn't kind to bone, it's likely there were at least 60 burials here at the site. And one thing I haven't mentioned is that there seems to have been almost no relationship between land-based shrines and burials. So again, what this represents is really hard to say. So we've talked about ritual deposition and we've talked about structure. The one remaining element that really elevates the significance of Hallaton, Womburgh, Harlow and Hayling Island, particularly in the phases when all but Harlow were open air, is feasting. And this is important, as evidence for feasting can really demonstrate that people were coming en masse to a site. You can't say for certain that they met for religious purposes, but unlike ritual deposition, you do know that they were gathering for a reason, and that the encounter probably featured as highly important in their lives when you consider the disparate nature of their communities. To give a sense of scale, were you to assume that half of the meat that would have been available from the known pig carcasses at Hallaton were, if that was wasted or given to the gods, 4,500 pounds of meat would still have been eaten. That's enough to feed more than 4,000 people in a sitting. Now, it's likely these feasts, as I say, occurred perhaps annually, and judging from the age of the animals in the autumn or winter months, and possibly to celebrate a festival. But with the activity likely to have been confined to the AD 30s and 40s, it's probably fair to assume that hundreds of people descended on Hallaton at any one time, and that they would have had to drive many, many pigs, many, many miles to do so. It would have been quite a major undertaking. So in many ways, the social investment, as well as the wealth represented by the pigs, would have been greater than contributions of metalwork. I mean, there's a great debate actually about whether hoards were, the principal wealth of a single or a few individuals, or the combined kind of contributions for whole communities. But with feasting, I don't think there's any doubt. The purpose of feasting, in all contexts, is typically assumed to have been about the aggrandizement of certain leaders, allowing them to secure or reinforce alliances, raise military forces, or the recruitment of work parties. The evidence in these religious contexts may indicate the celebration of annual festivals too, but like the coin deposition of this period, these particular celebrations appear really quite extraordinary. Undoubtedly, feasting and the general opportunity of bringing large groups of people together would have had many important social and secular purposes, arranging marriages and more localized support for work parties, as well as the bigger alliances I mentioned. We also know that feasting itself was heavily ritualized. Classical writers talk salaciously about Celtic drinking and feasting parties, describing specific rituals, such as where individuals would sit in order of rank, and who get the best cuts of meat. There's actually a later Irish legend of the warrior Conall deliberately provoking a fight to the death by giving himself the choicest cut of meat and his enemies the forelegs. And the mention of forelegs, by the way, is really quite interesting, because at Hallaton, not only were there were whole articulated sections of pigs apparently deposited as voters in their own right. Right forelimbs, rather oddly, seem to be missing, or a large percentage of them seem to be missing. Right forelimbs also appear in burials during this period, and actually feature in midden sites too. So it may be that they were associated with death, or perhaps were unclean in some kind of a way. More generally, however, feasting is not readily recognised in the archaeological record, and in ritual contexts it appears quite rarely. We know from another shameless plug of Colchester Castle. We know from the grave goods from high status burials of the late 1st century BC and 1st century AD, the significance placed by leaders on feasting and drinking. So this is a Lexton burial from Colchester, but in particular, graves from Essex and Hertfordshire generally are some of the richest, and you can see imported wine amphora, wine strainers, and more rarely tankards. I'm afraid I'm going to take the opportunity to digress briefly on tankards, because they are quite interesting. This on the left here is a pretty tankard handle which was found at Hallaton, and next to it is a better preserved Welsh example, actually made in bronze. Clearly highly decorated Latin artwork, as it's known. They were designed for passing around and sharing, so quite large tankards. Although it is interesting, we had a replica made of the Hallaton one, and it's actually quite difficult to get your fingers around it. It's a little bit awkward, but that's by the by. But interestingly, in the period, the containers often appear to have been made from yew. And yew is actually poisonous, and there are post-conquest stories of Roman soldiers dying from using these tankards. And it's possible they perhaps were just drinking straight from these tankards and they weren't sharing them in the way they were supposed to. Who knows? But it's hypothesized that the poison could actually induce hallucinations, and it's highly unlikely, particularly considering the ancient mythologies that surround you, that Iron Age people weren't aware of those toxic properties. I'm always always up for a bit of experimental archaeology, but particularly where it involves beer. But I'm not sure I'm quite ready for drinking from a yew tankard just yet. We know then that feasting was probably quite common, but interestingly, it seems to occur more frequently within settlements, typically identified through more unusual assemblages of animal bones, such as the presence of pig bones in particular. With the perishable nature of animal bone assemblages, it's always going to be difficult, I think it's fair to say, to identify locations for feasting, particularly when you can think, well, most of those excavations are going to be happening, or investigations are going to be happening at settlements. So you're going to pick it up more there. If it's in more random locations, it's going to be very hard to find indeed. But nevertheless, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of evidence of a connection between feasting and ritual deposition at sacred sites, again, prior to the 1st century BC or even the 1st century AD. This idea really of a multifunctional religious site of worship and congregation doesn't seem to have been a feature in the Iron Age, or at least not until the decades immediately around the Roman invasion. When I was looking at Haliton and ritual deposition more generally in the landscape, something else struck me about feasting. The quantity of articulated pig bones at Haliton and sheep at Hayling Island and Harlow, apparently, given to the gods, weren't necessarily the choicest cuts either, and they were perhaps the byproduct of this activity we know to have been feasting. And likewise, the fragments of metal, ingots, and the prevalence but not total selection of particular metals made me wonder if hoards were the byproduct of another ritualized secular activity. So let's say a ruler wanted to reissue coinage, but rather than seek the raw materials, so gold or silver, it would instead make more sense to issue a request in some way for the collection of coins from the previous ruler or neighboring kingdom, or whatever you want to call it, to melt down and send to your own mints at your ruling base. These collections could be a form of tribute or an opportunity to meet with other elites, and may well have been ritualized events in their own right. And those kind of ritualized events would have necessitated a proportional gift to the gods, in the same way your feasters were putting a proportionate amount of the meat as a gift to the gods. What may have been a kind of an ad hoc, occasional practice of tribute giving could have become a far more urgent, grander, and frequent occurrence during the Roman conquest. Rulers would have needed to solidify their rule and alliances, perhaps raise funds for war, and so on. Indeed, the advent of coins in Britain may have coincided with the rise of elites towards the end of the period, evidenced by the growing extent of conspicuous consumption in graves in southern Britain, like the one at Leicestershire. At sites like Hallaton, Schnetichem, and Womber, the sheer scale of deposition would make this seem unlikely, but I think there are 2 points to consider. Firstly, deposition across the country at this period was happening at an enormous scale anyway. That could, of course, be put down to the uncertainty of the period, as a noted behaviour of rituals being exaggerated to the point of breaking in periods of great change, and of course periods of great violence too. And you see an increase in flight hoards. Equally, however, there may have been far greater wealth than is typically recognised in the archaeological record. John Talbot calculated that in East Anglia alone, 32,000 kilograms of silver and nearly 2,000 kilograms of gold were used in the production of coins. Now, even assuming a high degree of recycling, we must be seeing a small fragment of that. As I say, and again, the anthropological evidence also suggests that people's gifts to the gods tend to represent what they can afford and what they have available to them. And admittedly, this can change in times of great stress as people exaggerate ritual acts to improve their efficacy. I think, whether or not you buy into this theory, I think what can be said is that there is a sense that votive deposition and feasting was tied into secular activity, and the ritualization of that activity provided a greater sense of the occasion of an event. These shrines, for want of a better word, appear as quite transitory in the archaeological record because they are more evidential, really, of an event or series of events, like the Glastonburys of the day, rather than places of great significance in their own right, like we think of churches, mosques, and synagogues are to modern religions. However, like Glastonbury, in some cases, they may have adopted significance and even fame through a ritualization process that in some cases, like you can see at Hayling Island, Womber, Gosbecks maybe, and so on, but not Haliton for whatever reason, and that continued to establish that reputation well into the Roman period. So apart from Weisenway, which appears far from transitory, and I don't understand Fison Way. I tend to ignore it because it simply doesn't fit into any of my theories. It was, however, other thing I should say about Fison Way, it was abandoned quite swiftly in the late 1st century AD, and there's just a smidgen of evidence of a Roman military presence at that point. So potentially it was kind of closed down by the Roman army. So perhaps these sites shouldn't be called shrines, as they weren't initially, at least, religiously significant in of themselves, more that they provided convenient locations for ritualized activity. They were the next stage from the one-off, slightly more banal activities seen all over Britain before this period. That this next stage represented important occasions when the world must have appeared a very uncertain and very chaotic place. I also say convenient, because these sites are often described as remote locations in classical references and by academics. And I think because of associations with descriptions of kind of druidic sacred groves and also flight hoards, of course, where you've got things being hidden for safekeeping. So it's picked up this idea that they were going to be in remote locations. But actually, there seems to have been a prevalence for sites in hillsides facing east, that's for one thing far from hidden, but these sites were actually quite close to settlements very often. Hallaton, for instance, was close by to roundhouses, which from the point of view of feasting would have been practically necessary. And I think for the metalwork deposition too, proximity to settlements was about practical convenience, even if part of the ritualized elements included observance of watercourses and the rising sun. This idea of kind of convenience and lack of structure, by the way, shouldn't demote their significance. Vicky Score, who's the site director for Hallaton, going back 10 years now, noticed this contemporary parallel, modern parallel rather, which actually I think this is banned now as a ceremony. This is because for animal rights reasons. This is a picture of the Kavanryman festival in Nepal, where tens of thousands of animals were, or maybe still are, ritually slaughtered, and people travel with their animals for hundreds of miles to attend. And like any festival or nearly empty field, bar in Hallaton's case, that 50-meter palisade, it can appear uninspiring, that kind of empty field in of itself, but populated with hundreds or thousands of people, music, animals, and so you can imagine the sounds, the smells, particularly to people unused to crowds, and then suddenly it's a big deal. And in this context, Hallaton's palisade might even be a form of kind of crowd control, rather than necessarily the demarcation of the sacred on one side. And you think of kind of dike systems and other enclosures that were frequently used in the Iron Age in that manner, and you can start looking at things differently, and that kind of movement, control of livestock and people and their movement, or a bit of both, who knows. This may also, of course, been part of an evolution of shrines, an evolution that in northern France had already occurred with well-established shrines, potentially, like this at Gournay-sur-Oron. And these Gaulish types may likewise have influenced or accelerated the creation of places that we might more easily identify as places of worship. And this is quite Romanized, by the way. I don't think this would have been a later phase in the Iron Age. Possibly it would have been a bit more rustic, but you certainly get the impression. And in these kind of sites and others like it, you have really quite large deposits of weapons and treasures as well, occasionally plundered by the Romans, but very often respected too. But as I say, these Gaulish types might have influenced the creation of places like Hayling Island. But any ongoing evolution was clearly changed very abruptly by the Roman conquest. And that's probably quite a good place to stop. I mentioned as well that there was the other conference happened, or a panel discussion about how the Haliton treasure was discovered. Really quite fascinating, and there's some really new information that's come up about, for instance, the helmet and different things. So do have a look at Harbour Museum's Facebook, and you'll find that in the videos section, that panel discussion. I do recommend it. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Frank.
Oh. Have I stopped sharing? Yes.
Yes, I think you have. Thank you. We've got a few questions if you're happy to answer them now.
Yeah, of course.
I'll just go back to the first one, which was, I think they got sent in advance from Ken and Hazel Wallace, who were
lovely.
the finders of the Hallaton treasure 20 years ago. Well, they'll be watching. I'm not sure if they got to grips with the chat box, but that's why they sent them in advance. So their first question for you was, would you like to see further excavation of the site? Where would you put the trenches?
Oh, that's a question for a proper archaeologist, I would say, not an armchair one. That's one for Vicky. I mean, there has been quite a lot of investigation, of course, around the site, and I think that's probably right. Looking at the wider context, I think the excavators were pretty convinced that they'd picked up everything, and of course, it was so. And I think probably, to be fair, Ken and the Hallaton Fieldwork Group would know better than I, but I think the investigation that's been happening and looking at, again, that wider context where there's a possible Roman temple somewhere in that area and certainly a medieval shrine is interesting, particularly when you look at the kind of Fiskerton example of the monastery that kind of grew up around those ancient beliefs. So I would hesitate before kind of talking about specific putting extra trenches. What I have noticed about other sites, and I was involved in another site only 6 months ago, actually. It's usually quite disappointing. There's this initial wonderful find that is just out of this world, like Haliton, quite incredible. And then you think, oh, there must be more. There must be more, like you'd find with the Roman site, possibly, and there just isn't. And it doesn't surprise me in many ways. I mentioned about Haliton, this possible enclosure. I think largely that kind of enclosure going all the way around was kind of assumed, but it doesn't particularly surprise me that there wasn't, or there may not have been at least, an enclosure going all the way around. So,
okay. Their second question was, compared with other Iron Age sites, what does the Hallaton site lack?
Well, it's that continuity into the Roman period, I guess. Having not only, there isn't a possibility that there's a Roman temple somewhere not too far away, but often there does seem to have been a Roman temple directly on top in these sites. Again, the archaeological record is quite distorted, I think, by how many times there's a claim that there's a temple, there's an Iron Age precursor to a Roman temple, when actually you dig down and you have a look, metaphorically, I mean. I don't get my hands dirty, you know that. You kind of really look at the evidence, you find there's very little for that Iron Age period at all. So, how often that Iron Age precursor is assumed and how often there is that Roman temple. But anyway, it is odd how quickly, hi Iris, how often, as I say, that temple would kind of grown out and become something else.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
I think if there's anything else.
A young archaeologist dying to get in on the action. Thank you. Next question was...
I noticed in the chat, by the way, there's someone mentioning about drinking from a tankard of you.
Oh, yes, I was going to...
So someone's already doing that, experimental archaeology. So, it is interesting that I think... So I took that about the poison being from a very good article about you, but it's not unusual for us archaeologists to kind of find an interesting idea and really kind of latch onto it and kind of start building castles in the sky. So yeah, quite possibly there's not huge into it, but you does have a lot of mythology around it, and that's clearly centuries old. So yeah, there's something in that, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I've just know. Yeah, Suffolk, who mentioned that his or her reproduction vessel, Iron Age tankard vessel, he's watching from Texas, so maybe Texan you isn't poisonous. I don't know. Anyway, sorry, on to the next question. We had a question from Jackie Williams. Where was the gold and silver mined? Was it Welsh gold, Cornish silver? I know this is a question we often get asked about Haliton.
That's interesting. Well, the silver predominantly comes from the Roman world, doesn't it? That seems to be the kind of accepted wisdom. So where it came from before that is I'm not quite sure. I'm just trying to cast my mind back, because funnily enough, Helen sent me a very good article written by Julia Farley at the British Museum, and she talks about this quite well. So there's a very good article on it written by Julia Farley. I'd recommend you look into. But predominantly, it's coming from the Roman world, really, one way or another, either in other forms, either as coinage or bullion.
Yeah, I think that is good. Yeah, it's coming, and maybe the gold is from Gaulish gold.
Oh, sorry, and gold. Yeah. Like again, we do. I forget the article. I don't know if Matthew or if there's a good Bronze Age archaeologist on. But I remember there's some very interesting work about gold in the Bronze Age, and where it seems to have been kind of brought in but through indigenous sources in the Bronze Age, and then it stops. And it seems to then, and there's a whole period where there's this lack of gold, and then it starts coming back from the continent again. And why it doesn't come back from the from British Isles isn't entirely known. But I may have made all of that up. So if there's if there's a proper prehistorian here, please jump in.
I do know that, you mentioned Julia Farley, who's the current curator of the Iron Age at the British Museum. She obviously started off at the University of Leicester, and she did some work on the Haliton objects themselves. And in the ULAS monograph on Haliton, there is some of her scientific analysis of the silver from the sites, the silver objects. So it may be worth getting hold of a copy of that if you want to know a bit more about it. Is a very very technical thing to work out where the silver came from. I know it's a little bit beyond my brain, so have a read of that. It's behind me here on the shelf, the lovely purple monograph by Vicky Score. Okay, another one. I mean, a question I thought of while you were talking, Frank, was that I know at Hallaton we only had one human bone found, and you mentioned that other site that was causing you a headache, having 60 burials, was it, Fison Way? In terms of the other sites, such as Womber, Harlow, Hayling Island, do any of those have evidence for human remains?
So Hayling Island, I should have mentioned actually, Hayling Island does, and actually that's been associated with kind of kings and different things. But actually Hayling Island's human remains, I think, kind of fall into that picture of Iron Age sites generally, where you just get random human remains just scattered liberally over them in the kind of peculiar way that is the Iron Age. They're strangely devoid, I would say, of human remains, but not in a ritualized way. So not in a way they've been kind of scoured clean because ideas of kind of uncleanliness or something around human remains, nothing like that. But when you think of other sites like other major like hill forts and although that's earlier, of course, but settlement sites with enclosures and defences and different things, where you get whole bodies within those embankments and different things, and then just and at the bottom of pits and storage pits and things like that. It's almost odd that you don't get more in shrines. So it's that relationship, as I say, is quite lacking. There's various kind of papers written that I think are a little out of date now about, for instance, there's a site called West Hampnet in Sussex, which is a graveyard, a whole cemetery that there were temples associated with that. But actually, again, if you look at it, the structures of those are really quite weak, and there is this these links to these ideas, these kind of temples from these structures from like Heathrow and different things, where that structure is really being lost. And when you look at it, they don't bear much semblance, and they are quite flimsy, as I say. So they're more likely actually practical huts rather than anything you'd really describe as temples. So on the main, I would say that no, human remains aren't associated with these shrines, if you call them shrines. But then, as I say, I'm not really convinced they're shrines either. Yeah. Now, there are very interesting sites. So there's one at Trumpington, just outside Cambridge, which is fascinating, where they look like they're actually kind of curating human remains. And when you think about, so there's been some work, for instance, of the human remains that have been found at Danebury Hill Fort, and those where it looks like these bodies that were put in the defences for spiritual guardians or whatever they were, weren't some poor soul who had been just killed and then dumped in the ditch or whatever. They came from somewhere else, and they've been in the ground for a while. Then they were taken out, put there, and a site like Tombstone is where these bodies were curated. And we don't know much about that, whether they were enemy warriors, or sometimes they were women and children, but more often male. But we don't know who they were, whether they were venerated ancestors. There's plenty of cultures, past and present, actually, that venerate their ancestors and have those human remains even within their living spaces. So we just don't know what those contexts are. But in the kind of shrines or whatever we're talking about, no, is the short answer. So
no, that is definitely interesting. Yeah, when they obviously you find all sorts of bits and bobs at other places, but this type of site doesn't seem to have them. That is interesting. We had a question from Matthew. How common is it for Iron Age shrines to have Roman successors?
Oh, sorry, I got distracted there briefly. Sorry, by Matt Beamish. West Hampton, the cremation pyres site. So yeah, there's cremation pyres. So cremation structures, but there are these strange little structures as well. So, but yeah, they're proper burials. That's not the curation of bone there. No, that's a very different type of site to Trumpton. Sorry, can you sorry, say that again, Helen?
How common is it for Iron Age shrines to have Roman successors?
Well, as I say, there's a lot of kind of assumed continuity, and that's so you get a nice Roman temple and then a smidgen of Iron Age evidence, and then people kind of go, oh, there you go, they've got the Iron Age precursor. So you must have been an Iron Age shrine before that. And I say that kind of practice of, when you look at one theory I've not mentioned, which is a very good one, I think, is I've forgotten her first name, something Hutchison, who talks about ritualized landscapes, and I think that's a very good parallel to the more kind of practical theory, if you like, that I've kind of proposed, and that's where you have, like, for instance, a river, and along that river you have lots of kind of metalwork deposits on the hillsides around and things like that, and you can imagine someone who's more kind of, let's say, spiritually aligned with their landscape could see that kind of this spiritual kind of elements of the whole area, rather than these kind of individual sites like we think of as churches and different things in our more kind of modern day religions, in the West at least, anyway. Mm-hmm. So lots and maybe none. I do think, I mean, Gosbex is a good example, actually, where it seems hard to believe that the Romans would invest so much energy with this Romano-British temple, and don't forget, in Colchester as well, you've got a massive, proper, if you like, classical Roman temple in the centre. So this is something more for indigenous people, on the outskirts, if you like, with a theatre, one of the largest in Britain, bathhouses and all these kind of things. If there wasn't anything kind of ceremonial or anything like that before that, and you've still got these confluence of dikes. So I think inevitably there must have been religious sites that were just coming to the kind of formation of this evolution of shrines, if you like. That had already happened in Gaul, happened in continent, but it was really early stages in Iron Age Britain, and it just hadn't really come to any fruition yet, possibly.
We've just had another comment from Suffolk about their tankard that we were worried was poisonous, but not. And they've shared a useful link about British Iron Age tankards, and that their U came from southern Scotland, and it's as authentic as they could make it. So that's interesting. Maybe worth a look at that paper.
Oh, amazing! Can you put a picture in the chat? That'd be good.
Oh yes, if you've got it to hand.
That'd be amazing.
I'm just having a look to see. There's a comment from Matt Beamish. There is always an archaeological difficulty in distinguishing between sporadic events in the same place and supposed continuity. Without very precise chronologies, it remains so difficult to recognise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, we're getting a photo of the tankard shortly, apparently. I just thought, oh yeah, that was another question that occurred to me just then, Frank. So obviously at Haliton we have the really interesting deposit of the Roman cavalry helmet and seven cheap pieces, one of which definitely belonged to the bowl that we have. Obviously seems like a very structured deposit in the 450s AD. Do any of the other shrines you have, using that word, mentioned, have any of them got Roman military equipment? I'm guessing not.
If there are, it's infrequent, and it's not something you'd really go nuts about, if you know what I mean. Nothing like that, no. As I say, these military kind of accoutrements don't really feature a huge amount. Hayling Island's quite unusual to have any at all. It's not many. I can't remember how many years. It's like 7 or 8 spearheads or something. It's nothing like you get from, as I say, Northern Gaul, where you get these Riebemont. It's the famous one where you have like hundreds of swords and different things. It's really quite extraordinary. So no, nothing that really springs to mind. It's interesting, isn't it? Good question.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just having a look, see if we've got any other questions. If anybody has got anything else, burning question to ask before we lose Frank, obviously now is your chance. I'm just having a look back in case I've missed some.
Oh, we can't go until we've seen this tankard, can we?
Yes, exactly. We've got to hang on from the tankard. Sorry, I'm just going through. I can't see any other questions at the moment, so yeah, we're just waiting for this lovely tankard to.
Oh, no pressure now.
Matt has said, "What shaped tankard could you not get your fingers around, Frank?" Well, I do have a photograph of the Hallaton treasure replica tankard.
Oh, good, because I couldn't find one actually. I was putting these photos a bit late. I should have.
I'm not sure I could manage to share it via this at the moment, but maybe I could post that somewhere, or we could share it via our social media tomorrow. It is a lovely object. It is made of wood. We should say also with the Hallaton treasure tankard, it wasn't just the handle that we found. We did find
the rims, yeah.
The fieldwork group and ULAS found lots of little kind of bronze rim sections, so yeah, we know it did have metal elements as well as being wood, but the replica we had made, it was a lovely but quite thick rimmed wooden vessel, wasn't it? So yeah, I can imagine it would have been quite tricky to drink from, but yeah, it's interesting. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Frank, about anything you just didn't get time to mention this evening while we're waiting for our tankard image?
Well, I mean, the only other thoughts, Helen, if you want to mention something, because I didn't cover all of the objects at from Haliton. I did miss out a couple. I didn't talk about the bowl. I mean, the bowl's fascinating.
Yeah.
And really, again, really quite unusual. There's another bowl I think from right on the kind of border of Scotland, and there's one supposedly from Schnetichem that was stolen with the hollowed gold coins. But other than that, they're quite unusual. They're quite there aren't many of them at all.
Yeah.
So what that bowl's about is quite interesting, and that's been associated with some images on coins, for instance, about some of the rituals that would have occurred from people kind of drinking from them. And somebody's actually said, funnily enough, in the chat, I've noticed about cupping these kind of cups and drinking from them as part of these kind of rituals. So that bowl, certainly these tankards, no, they definitely did have these kind of tankards like this, and that you would have kind of passed to people, and you had them with 2 hands like this. So as I say, they're just a bit awkward, really. I don't know quite.
Yeah. I mean, it is an interesting contrast that at the same time we've got these 2 vessels, the one a very communal passing round vessel, whereas the silver bowl, as it said, is very small, delicate, more like just one person would use it. It's an interesting contrast, definitely. But yeah, I mean, other items from Hallaton which just occurring to me is the 2 little blue and white glass eyes, which
I was just going to say that
may have been in a wooden idol with some gold foil. That is an interesting item, which I think the glass turned out from analysis to be a Roman kind of type. So yeah, that, I mean, that's, are there any other idols been found anywhere?
So again, really unusual. I would say you do get, and probably because they tend to, if there was an Iron Age precursor to statues like that, statuettes rather, if that indeed was, probably would have been wooden, and they've perished. And there are some examples of wooden ones, largely earlier actually, and again in water context, where the wood survived, so presumably votive deposits into the water. And there's a few of those, 3 or 4 of them, and possibly more actually, come to think of it. And they're quite crude, I would say. And when you think about it, Iron Age people were quite capable of doing some really quite beautiful things, and certainly in terms of, you think of your kind of Latin art and different things. So I don't know about those and how representational they were of kind of idolatry. Certainly classical sources talk about kind of worship of the focal point in shrines, but again they always tend to focus on the continent, which is again quite different. So it is interesting. And when you think about kind of Roman art that have been done, that's clearly been created by Britons, if you like, kind of adopting Roman techniques and different things, that you do get those kind of quite bulging eyes and things like. It is different to Roman work. And those kind of eyes feature in that, and they're clearly deities. So it's hard to say at what point, the Romans take out, the Romanization, if you like, takes over from the Iron Age religion, or how much of it preceded. There must have been an element, I think, because it's very swift to take up of this Romano-British temple style, and some of these other kind of elements come on very quick. And I've already mentioned the headdresses, of course, which so I suspect a lot of it is so unusual, unlike coins and things like that in the Iron Age. They haven't survived in the archaeological context, in the archaeological record, and so we just haven't got them. Is my guess. But so yeah, those eyes are fascinating.
Yeah, they are good. I'm just seeing we're having problems with the tankard image, but perhaps Cypher can send it to the
yeah, that'd be cracking.
Archaeological Society's email address, and we can share that again on social media if you'd be happy for us to do that, if we're having trouble this evening. We've had another comment from Matt Beamish. In a former life, I attended an institution with a ceremonial goblet with an ostrich shell cup. It was very awkward to pass around, and perhaps that was part of the ceremonial weirdness. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that is interesting. I just thought of another object from Haliton, Frank, which I think possibly has a parallel at Wombre, was the possible
staff.
The bronze copper alloy scepter with wooden kind of
yeah absolutely. I mean, again, that's it is what it is, that object, isn't it? I mean, there's not a huge amount to go on, but you're right. I mean, that what the closest. So I mentioned the headdresses, but there were these kind of scepters from Wombre as well, and so it's interesting. You get something that not massively dissimilar. Or one object really from Haliton that's not massively dissimilar. So yeah, it's interesting. And that was out of context, wasn't it? If you know what I mean, it wasn't one of the hoards. It wasn't part of a kind of ritual deposit. Almost like it was lost from memory. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was possibly with the pig bones, perhaps in that kind of the tankard area.
Yeah, but you didn't feel like it was ritually deposited like many of the other objects. It felt like it was a genuine loss, which would add to that story, I think, rather than it being an object that people seem to kind of gather around and to put in as one of these deposits. So who knows? Yeah. I mean, that's what I love about Haliton, though. There's so many kind of different things you can kind of different elements to it you can explore.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Frank. Well, I think we're coming to the end. Great. Well, thank you, Frank, for a fascinating talk and giving us some more food for thought on Haliton. It's a fantastic site. Even 20 years later, we are still bamboozled. That's always fun. And just to say that there will be, hopefully at some point, not too long, COVID hopefully out of the way, we will be putting the rest of the Haliton helmet assemblage on display at some point at Harbour Museum. This, as we've said, there are 7 cheek pieces, so currently 2 displayed at Harbour with the bowl. There's further 5 cheek pieces which we'll be hoping to display in the not too distant future, and hopefully doing a bit more around those. So yeah, there's plenty more discussion to be had with Haliton. Just to say a quick note about the Archaeological and Historical Society's next talk, which will be via Zoom again on Thursday the 15th of April at 7:30 p.m, and the subject is Lost Houses of Stony Gate in Leicester by Neil Crutchley of the Victorian Society. So again, booking will be via Eventbrite, and you'll find, you know, that will be circulated in due course, so please have a look at that one. So yes, thanks again, Frank, and yeah, we hope to see you again soon somewhere.